The Ashworth townhouse on Kensington Square had stood for 170 years, watching London transform from gas lamps to electric lights. When Marcus and Claire inherited it from their estranged great-aunt, they believed they'd received a burden, a crumbling Victorian facade with water damage, rotting floorboards, and the smell of stale history. The surveyor's report was damning. Structural repairs would cost more than the property itself seemed worth. Yet something about the house called to them, a gravitational pull that neither sibling could quite name. The restoration began quietly in March, with scaffolding rising against the northern wall like the skeleton of some sleeping creature. Marcus, a structural engineer, directed the work with precision. Claire, an archivist by training, began cataloguing the detritus left behind. Old bills, letters, photographs of strangers frozen in Victorian formality. They worked in separate worlds within the same walls, each searching for meaning in the house's secrets. Neither expected to find what lay behind the plaster in the east parlour. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the workers discovered it, not through intention, but through accident. A sledgehammer intended for the damaged plaster near the fireplace had struck deeper than expected, and the wall had surrendered its secret with a sigh of ancient dust. Behind the false wall, sealed away for perhaps a century, lay a chamber barely 6 feet square, and inside, arranged with deliberate ceremony, were 3 skeletons dressed in the tattered remnants of expensive 19th century clothing. What stopped Marcus's breath was the detail. Each skull wore a mask fashioned from lead, shaped to the contours of a human face, with empty eye sockets staring outward into the darkness they had inhabited for decades. Chapter 1. The Discovery. The police arrived within an hour, their disbelief mirroring Marcus's own. Detective Inspector Sarah Chen stood in the parlour, her torch cutting through the restored room, illuminating dust motes that danced like spectres. She was methodical, professional, but her eyes betrayed something deeper, a hunger for the strange story that lay before her. "How long?" Marcus asked, standing at the threshold of the chamber. "Post-mortem analysis will tell us," Chen replied, "but the degradation of the bone, the fabric, I'd estimate somewhere between 80 and 120 years. Late Victorian, early Edwardian at the latest." Claire emerged from the hallway, her face pale but composed. She'd already begun mentally arranging the mystery, cataloguing it like a document awaiting translation. "The false wall is deliberate," she said quietly. "Whoever sealed this chamber didn't want it found casually. This was intentional architecture." The lead masks caught the light as the forensic photographer worked, their blank faces somehow more unsettling than any expression could have been. They were crude, not sculpted with artistry, but hammered into shape with methodical purpose, and each bore tiny holes around the temples, as though something had once been attached, or as though the wearer needed to breathe through a deliberate gap. "Why lead?" Claire wondered aloud. Chen's jaw tightened. Heavy metal, once used in medicine, in cosmetics, also used in occult practices, as far as the historical records suggest. She paused. "We'll need to know everything about who lived here, every name, every owner, every servant's record you can find." By evening, the house had become a crime scene, though what crime had been committed remained catastrophically unclear. The yellow tape cordoned off the parlour. Police constables stood like sentinels at the front door, and Marcus and Claire found themselves sitting in the kitchen, stunned and secondary to the investigation they'd inadvertently triggered. "Great-Aunt Dorothy never mentioned this," Claire whispered. "She may not have known," Marcus replied. But doubt coiled beneath his words. The house kept its own counsel, and the thought that his great-aunt had walked these halls, lived with this secret entombed within her walls, sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the March evening. Chapter 2. Inheritance of Questions. The next morning brought new complications. The house's ownership records, filed at the registry office, painted a fragmented picture. The Ashworth townhouse had changed hands 7 times since its construction in 1847, but one name appeared across 3 consecutive decades: Dr. Edmund Ashworth, who had purchased the property in 1867 and held it until his death in 1891. Claire discovered him in the archives of the Royal Society of Medicine, a footnote in medical history, neither celebrated nor condemned, simply present. Dr. Edmund Ashworth had conducted research into what he called the physical manifestation of neural pathology. His papers, published in obscure journals between 1869 and 1880, discussed craniometry, the measurement of human skulls, and his theories about how the shape of bone might dictate the nature of the mind. He was a phrenologist, Marcus said, reading over her shoulder at the library table. A pseudoscientist. Worse than that, Claire replied. He believed the theories. Look, he proposed experiments to verify his hypotheses, cranial modifications, he called them. He wanted to reshape the human skull in living subjects to alter behavior. The lead masks began to make a terrible kind of sense. A knock at the library door interrupted her thoughts. Detective Inspector Chen entered, bearing a manila folder and an expression of controlled urgency. "We've identified one of them," she announced. "At least, we think we have. The dental records are incomplete, but—" She laid down a photograph of a woman's face, rendered in brown ink from the 1880s. Her name, according to the caption, was Margaret Holt, governess, reported missing from a household in Belgravia in 1883. "And the connection to Ashworth?" Marcus asked. "She was employed at this address," Chen said quietly. "According to household records we've been retrieving, she worked here for 3 months before vanishing. The family that hired her reported it to the police, but the investigation went nowhere. No body was ever found." Claire felt the weight of 100 years of silence pressed down upon her shoulders. Somewhere in this house, in the years when gas lamps flickered and servants moved through corridors now empty, something unspeakable had occurred. And it had been sealed away, deliberately hidden, as though the perpetrator believed that brick and plaster could contain not just bodies, but truth itself. She was about to speak when Chen's phone rang. The detective inspector's expression shifted as she listened, her jaw hardening with each passing second. "We'll be right there," Chen said finally, ending the call. She looked at both of them with an intensity that suggested the mystery had just transformed into something far more dangerous. The second skeleton. "We found marks on the radius bone, evidence of restraint. And the third one. The third one shows signs of blunt force trauma to the occipital bone. The lead mask on that body has deep gouges, as though it were being torn away from the inside." The implication hung in the air between them. Someone had worn that mask while still alive. Chapter 3. The pattern. Over the following week, Marcus and Claire became unwilling archaeologists of their own inheritance. The house existed in a strange liminal space, no longer theirs to inhabit, not yet cleared as a crime scene. They moved through the rooms like ghosts themselves, gathering documentation that Chen had requested: deeds, utility records, household registries, anything that might illuminate the decades Ashworth had owned the property. The parlour remained sealed, but they could see the chamber through the fracture in the wall, a rectangular tomb of darkness that seemed to swallow light. Marcus had tried to reconstruct Ashworth's purpose by examining the walls, the floor, any detail that might suggest the room's original function. There was a table, long since decomposed to splinters, shelving now collapsed, and on one wall a series of markings, measurements in faded chalk, tallies of some kind, or perhaps indices of the experiments conducted within. Claire found Ashworth's personal journals in the library's back room, tucked behind a false panel that the contractors discovered while assessing structural integrity. The handwriting was precise, almost mechanical. and the entries were clinical in their detachment. Subject A, she read aloud to Marcus. 7 days post-application. Cerebral agitation continues. Subject demonstrates increased tractability following administration of laudanum. The cranial modification device functions as theorized. Circumference reduction of 3 centimeters already observed. Marcus looked away. He was tightening their skulls, deliberately compressing the cranium. To reshape the mind, he believed, Claire said quietly. He was trying to remake human beings according to his theories, to eliminate what he called neurological defects. She turned the pages, each entry a small atrocity. Subject B, this must be Margaret, was chosen due to her hereditary predisposition to emotional volatility. Subject C was a homeless man retrieved from the embankment. Ashworth believed he was a criminal type, visible in the structure of his face. The entries ended abruptly on October 12, 1883. The final passage was barely legible. Subjects A and C show signs of systemic infection. Mask removal was attempted, but the bone has begun to fuse around the lead edges. Permanent fixture now achieved. All subjects unconscious. Administered final doses to prevent further suffering. Claire closed the journal carefully, as though sudden movement might disturb the dead who haunted its pages. That evening, she and Marcus sat in the kitchen again, and Claire told him about Ashworth's work, about the theories that had driven a man to such deliberate cruelty. She explained how phrenology had been respected science once, how it had been used to justify slavery, to prove the inferiority of women, to identify criminals before they committed crime. He thought he was helping them, Marcus said flatly. Curing them. He thought he was perfecting them, Claire corrected. That's the terrifying part. He believed so absolutely in his own theories that he couldn't see the bodies beneath the ideology. A silence fell between them, the weight of history, the weight of knowing that their great-aunt had lived in this house after Ashworth's death, had walked past sealed walls and perhaps wondered what lay behind them. Perhaps she had known, perhaps she had simply chosen silence. If you're enjoying this adventure so far, tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Chapter 4. The Second Discovery. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. Detective Inspector Chen contacted them with news that shifted the entire investigation into new territory. The lead masks bore markings, tiny symbols stamped into the metal at regular intervals. A specialist from the British Museum had identified them as Masonic symbols, not the well-known compass and square, but older, more obscure marks, associated with a specific lodge that had operated in London during the 1870s. Ashworth was a Freemason, Chen explained, laying down a ledger she'd obtained from the lodge archives. Not a particularly prominent member, but he was involved. More importantly, he attended regular meetings at a lodge in Bloomsbury, where he gave lectures on what he called the perfection of human form through scientific discipline. Marcus studied the ledger, noting the names of men who had attended: physicians, surgeons, anatomists, philosophers, respectable men, distinguished men, men who had then returned to their practices, their lectures, their families. How many people knew? He asked. That's the question, Chen replied. And it's why I'm here to ask you something. We're conducting a more thorough excavation of the hidden chamber. The initial examination suggested there might be additional remains, perhaps beneath the floorboards. But we need your permission to proceed. We need to fully excavate the space. Marcus and Claire exchanged glances. The house had been transformed from an inheritance into an accusation. Digging deeper would only unearth more horrors. Yet they had no choice. Yes, Claire said, we need to know everything. The excavation took 3 days. A specialized team arrived with ground-penetrating radar and careful instruments. They removed the floorboards section by section, and beneath the initial 3 skeletons, they found evidence of something darker still, a mass grave, partially filled, containing the remains of what the pathologist estimated to be at least 5 more individuals. He was conducting his experiments for years, the pathologist, Dr. Whitmore, explained. These bones show varying degrees of degradation. The oldest are perhaps 40 years dead. The newest, she indicated the 3 with the lead masks, approximately 30 years. He continued after the house fell into disuse? Marcus asked. It doesn't appear to have fallen into disuse, Chen said quietly. According to our records, the house changed hands in 1891 after Ashworth's death. The new owner, a merchant named William Hatfield, lived here for 40 years. He would have known, or someone wanted him not to know, Claire countered. The false wall, the sealed chamber, these suggest active concealment, continuing concealment, generation after generation. She felt the weight of complicity settling on her shoulders. How many people had walked these halls knowing? How many had chosen silence? Chapter 5. The ledger. The breakthrough that changed everything came from an unexpected source. While forensic teams continued their excavation, Claire was cataloguing the remaining papers in the study when she discovered a second ledger. This one hidden not in the walls, but in a hollowed-out space within a book spine. It was bound in black leather, its pages yellowed with age, and its entries were written in a hand different from Ashworth's, more hurried, more anguished. The first entry was dated 1892, 1 year after Ashworth's death. I have inherited more than a house. I have inherited a nightmare, and the knowledge of it will consume me. The chamber remains locked, the bodies remain undisturbed. To report it would destroy my family's reputation, would implicate men of standing in the community. To leave it is to leave murder unavenged. There is no path forward that does not lead to damnation. The author was William Hatfield himself. Over the following pages, Hatfield chronicled his internal conflict. He had discovered the hidden chamber 6 months after taking possession of the house. He had been renovating, and a structural weakness had partially revealed what lay behind the false wall. He had seen Ashworth's journals. He had understood with horror and clarity what had occurred beneath his new roof, and he had chosen to cover it up. The entries grew increasingly desperate over the years. Hatfield paid off contractors who asked too many questions. He reinforced the false wall, made it more secure. He moved to a different house in Belgravia, but maintained ownership of the Kensington property, keeping it as a sepulchre, a locked tomb containing evidence he could not bring himself to reveal and could not bring himself to bury properly. By the 1920s, Hatfield's entries had become almost philosophical. The longer the silence continues, the more impossible disclosure becomes. To speak now would be to confess 30 years of complicity. The dead have been forgotten, or rather they have been deliberately forgotten by everyone but me. To resurrect them now would be an act of violence against the living who might be implicated, against the families who have moved on, against a society that has already decided to bury this knowledge beneath the foundations of respectability. He died in 1931. His will left the house to his daughter, who rented it to others and never once set foot inside. She, in turn, left it to her son, Marcus and Claire's great-uncle, who left it to their great-aunt Dorothy, who left it to them. Claire sat in the study, holding the ledger, understanding finally the burden that had been passed down through generations. Not just a house, but a secret. Not just an inheritance, but a complicity formed through silence. She called Detective Inspector Chen. It was after midnight, but she knew somehow that Chen would be awake, waiting for this call. I found who knew, Claire said quietly. I found the whole chain of silence. Chapter 6. Consequences. The publication of the story in the newspapers created a firestorm of historical revision. The Ashworth case, as it came to be known, became a touchstone for discussions about institutional complicity, about how respectable men could conduct horrors in basements and drawing rooms while the world continued above them, indifferent. The phrenological societies that had once been regarded with respect found their reputations reassessed. Medical schools began to acknowledge the cruelty embedded in their historical practices. Parliament ordered an inquiry into archival records. How many other doctors had conducted similar experiments? How many other houses held similar secrets? But for Marcus and Claire, the wider historical reckoning felt secondary to the more personal questions. Their great-aunt Dorothy had lived in the house for 12 years before her death. Had she known? The current evidence suggested she had at least suspected. There was a letter discovered among her papers, never sent, addressed to the local police commissioner. In it, she confessed to knowing that something terrible lay hidden within her walls, but expressed her inability to act, her fear of exposing her family to scandal, her growing belief that the dead had been dead so long that their resurrection would serve no purpose but to wound the living. "What would you have done?" Marcus asked Claire, the two of them standing in the now famous parlor, surrounded by photographs, forensic equipment, historical significance. "If you had lived then? If you had inherited this and found that chamber?" Claire had no answer. She didn't believe she could have done better than Dorothy had done. She didn't believe most people could have. Yet someone had had to know, not just Hatfield, but the contractors he'd hired. The servants who cleaned around the sealed walls, the neighbors who might have heard sounds from the basement. The conspiracy of silence required millions of tiny complicit choices, each person deciding that not knowing was preferable to knowing, that some secrets were too heavy to carry into daylight. If this treasure hunt already has you hooked, hit the like button. It helps us bring more forgotten stories to light. The excavation was completed by mid-April. 8 bodies in total were removed from the chamber and the mass grave beneath it. 4 were identified through dental records, family histories, or missing persons reports that had languished unsolved for a century. The other 4 remained unknown, homeless men, likely, or those whose disappearances had never been officially reported, whose absences went unnoticed by anyone with authority to care. They were given proper burials through the efforts of the church and various historical societies. Each received a name in death, even if the name was anonymous, unknown individual, 1870s. Each was allowed the dignity of ground consecrated and mourned, a dignity that had been denied them in the sealed chamber. Chapter 7. The Historian's Burden. As the official investigation concluded, Claire found herself drawn deeper into the archival work, not because she was required to, but because she felt she owed it to the dead. She began researching Ashworth in earnest, tracking down his academic records, his correspondence, his family history. She wanted to understand not just what he had done, but how he had come to do it, not to excuse it, but to map the precise coordinates of how ideology becomes atrocity. She discovered that Ashworth had a son who had emigrated to Canada in 1895, presumably to escape his father's legacy. That son had become a respected physician in Toronto, known for his innovative approach to patient care. There was a handwritten note in one of his published papers, a dedication to those whose suffering has been forgotten, that their names might inspire compassion in the living. Had he known? Had his father confessed before his death in 1891? Or had the son discovered the truth later, in letters or confessions, or perhaps through his own dawning horror, as he matured into an understanding of what his father had been? Claire created a digital archive of everything she'd discovered, not just the court documents and forensic reports, but the personal correspondence, the journals, the photographs of the people who had lived in and with this house across generations. She wanted the story to be preserved, but more than that, she wanted it to be understood in its full complexity, not as a simple tale of good and evil, but as a tragedy of institutional blindness, personal cowardice, and the ways that silence becomes its own kind of violence. She wrote in her introduction, "The men buried in this chamber were not unique in their suffering. Ashworth was not unique in his cruelty. What was unique was the documentation, the evidence that could not be destroyed, the bodies that refused to stay hidden. Thousands of others suffered similarly, in hospitals and asylums, in research facilities and private homes. We will never know all their names, but we can honor their memory by refusing to forget, by refusing to normalize the silence that protected their killers." Marcus, meanwhile, had turned his attention to the house itself. He worked with architects and historians to preserve the chamber as it had been found, not to exploit it as a macabre tourist attraction, but as a memorial space, ultimately to be made part of a museum dedicated to the history of medical ethics and institutional accountability. He carefully documented every crack in the plaster, every measurement, every detail of how the false wall had been constructed. The room would become a teaching tool, a physical reminder of how carefully cruelty could be hidden within respectable walls. The two of them rarely discussed their great-aunt Dorothy anymore. The anger that had initially colored their discovery had transformed into something more nuanced, a recognition that she too had been trapped, the victim of circumstances and complicity that had accrued over decades before her time. She had inherited not just a house, but the full weight of this horror, compressed into silence and structural compromise. They would never fully know what she had known, or when she had known it, or what suffering her silence had caused her. That ambiguity seemed somehow fitting, a mirror of the larger historical pattern in which so many truths remained partially buried, waiting for someone patient enough to excavate them. Chapter 8. The new tenants. In early summer, the first visitors arrived to see the preserved chamber. They came in small groups, escorted by Claire or by historians from the university that had partnered with them to run the memorial space. They walked the same hallways that Ashworth had paced, that Hatfield had avoided, that Dorothy had inhabited with her guilty knowledge. Their reactions were varied: shock, sadness, anger. A kind of hollow recognition that such things were possible had happened, might be happening still in other sealed chambers, other hidden rooms that had not yet been uncovered. One woman, a descendant of one of the identified victims, wept in the chamber and then thanked Claire for bringing her ancestor's name back into the world. "My great-grandmother never recovered," the woman said. "She never knew what happened to her sister. Now I can tell her story. Now she's not just missing, she's remembered." Marcus overheard this exchange and found Claire afterward, sitting in the study with Hatfield's ledger still open on the desk. "We did something right," he said quietly. "We did the minimum required of us," Claire replied. "We inherited something terrible, and we chose not to hide it. That's not virtue. It's just the bare necessity of not adding to the harm." Yet as she said this, she recognized that this too was a kind of burden. The knowledge that simply refusing to participate in silence was now permanently part of her identity. She could never unknow what she had learned. She could never inhabit the world as simply as she once had. The house slowly was being transformed. It would never be a home in the traditional sense, not for Marcus and Claire, who had decided to sell their inheritance to the university trust. They could not live within walls that contained such history. But the house was becoming something perhaps more important, a repository of memory, a space where the dead could finally speak, where history could be confronted rather than concealed. As summer advanced, the renovation work continued in parallel with the memorial preparation. The rest of the house, The rooms untouched by Ashworth's crimes was being restored to its Victorian elegance. There was something both respectful and defiant in this simultaneous restoration and exposure. The house would not be erased. Its beauty would not be permitted to overshadow its horrors, nor would its horrors be permitted to erase its beauty. It was a complicated legacy, and Claire found herself thinking often of her great-aunt, walking these halls with her guilty knowledge, trapped between the obligation to reveal and the paralysis of complicity. Chapter 9. The Weight of Knowing. By autumn, the memorial was nearly complete. The chamber was preserved under controlled conditions, accessible to historians and students, but never exploited as spectacle. The archive that Claire had created was online, fully searchable, a digital record that would outlast any single institution or generation. She stood in the chamber one final time before the official opening, looking at the space where the 3 lead-masked skeletons had been arranged. They were gone now, given proper burial, but the room remembered. The walls themselves seemed to hold the echo of what had occurred here, not in any supernatural sense, but simply in the physical fact of their arrangement, the stains on the stone, the marks of measurement on the wall. She thought about the nature of historical responsibility, how it cascaded down through generations, how each person inherited not just property but knowledge, complicity, and the impossible choice between speaking and surviving. "What are you thinking?" Marcus asked, joining her in the chamber. "That we didn't really discover anything," Claire said slowly. "Everything that happened here happened 100 years ago. We just chose not to look away." "And that matters," Marcus said. "Not knowing and choosing not to know are different things. We could have inherited the house, done the renovations, and never broken through that wall. We could have moved on with our lives, kept the secrets." "Great-Aunt Dorothy didn't," Claire said. "No," Marcus agreed, "and we don't know if that was courage or cowardice. Maybe it was both. Maybe she was doing the best she could with an impossible situation." They stood together in silence, honoring both the dead and their great-aunt, who had carried the weight of their unknown ends without letting that weight destroy her completely. The memorial opened to the public in October, during a grey London afternoon when the rain fell in steady sheets, washing the city clean, or attempting to, at any rate. The newspapers sent journalists. The university sent administrators. The descendants of victims and perpetrators alike came to bear witness to history that could no longer be hidden. Claire gave a speech that focused not on the sensational elements of the discovery, but on the mechanisms of silence. She spoke about how ordinary people, faced with extraordinary knowledge, often choose the path of least resistance. She spoke about complicity and responsibility. She spoke about how the dead deserve to be remembered not as curiosities, but as people whose existence, however briefly and painfully documented, matters. "We inherit many things from the past," she concluded. "Property, names, secrets. We also inherit the responsibility to be honest about what our ancestors did and what they failed to do. This house, this chamber, tells a story about the failure of individual conscience, about how institutions can normalize cruelty, about how silence becomes its own form of violence. But it also tells a story about restoration, the restoration of names to the nameless, dignity to the forgotten, memory to those history tried to erase." As she spoke, she saw people crying, not just relatives of the victims, but strangers, people who recognized in this story a pattern that extended beyond these walls. The story of Ashworth and Hatfield and Dorothy was a story that had been replayed countless times across history, in different locations, with different names. To memorialize it was to honor all those who had suffered in hidden places, to acknowledge that history was not simply what was written in public records, but also what had been deliberately concealed. What still lay hidden in sealed chambers, waiting for someone to be brave enough or curious enough to break through the walls. Epilogue. 6 months later, Marcus received a letter forwarded from the university. It was from a woman in Toronto, descendant of Dr. Edmund Ashworth's son. She wrote that she had discovered in her family archives a letter her great-grandfather had written but never sent, dated 1895, addressed to his father. In it he had written, "I cannot forgive you. I can only hope that one day the truth will emerge, and that those who suffered under your hands will be remembered. Silence is complicity, and I will not carry your secret forward." He had emigrated that same year. The letter had been preserved not as a memory of reconciliation, but as a document of resistance. His refusal to participate in the family's conspiracy of silence, his insistence that the truth, however terrible, mattered more than the family's reputation. Marcus shared this discovery with Claire, and they found themselves revising once again their understanding of history. The dead, it turned out, had allies they would never fully know about. People whose refusal to forget had echoed silently across generations, preparing the ground for the day when the chamber would finally be opened. The house on Kensington Square stood now as a memorial to those they had discovered and to those who had resisted forgetting. It was not a comfortable monument. It would never be, but it was an honest one. And in that honesty, the dead had finally found what had been denied to them for a century: the dignity of being remembered, the small but significant immortality that comes from having one's story told truthfully at last. Subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales of discovery and hidden history. See you in the next adventure.